There's a version of this that plays out almost every week with the leaders that I work with. It's 11 p.m. The email already says what it needs to say, but it's not sent. And you find yourself looking at this thing and saying, well, I need to edit this. And so you maybe change a couple of words and you go back and forth and eventually you end up not sending it. And no one necessarily looks at this like a crisis. It's just someone who really cares about their work and who is meticulous in what they're wanting to deliver. But if you took a moment and asked that person what was happening internally in that moment, it wasn't clarity. It was someone who was seeking a sense of certainty. And the dialogue sometimes sounds like this. I don't feel certain about myself. I don't feel certain about what I'm doing, but you keep on looping back and looking for certainty in that moment. And then we can come back to that email. It was never a writing problem. At the end of the day, it ends up being a capacity problem. And so you come to this place where you realize that a lot of your behavior actually has nothing to do with your personality, but rather something far more specific. And I'd even say much more solvable. I'm Nick Van Pitt. I'm a strategic advisor who works with founders, leaders, and business owners, helping people who've already achieved success on paper rebuild internal coherence, because that type of success costs you something. What I'm about to walk you through is essentially one of those patterns which is underneath a great deal of this work. So here's the core idea for this one. Control is what happens when capacity disappears. And I'd like you to think of control not as a personality trait, but rather as a symptom in this context. Think of it as the thing that shows up once something else has run out. So before we go any further, I want to define that something else, because this word ends up being used loosely, and I want to be really specific so that you can understand it before we go further. Capacity is your ability to stay present, think clearly, and respond intentionally under pressure. That's it. It's not time, it's not energy, it's just you'll be able to stay in the room, be clear, and being able to respond versus react whilst there's pressure. Most people, when they notice a pattern that they don't like, they ask themselves, why am I like this? Why do I do this? And it actually becomes a personal attack on how they see themselves. And it's quite easy to start shaming yourself as you start noticing these chinks in your armor, because we naturally compare. We compare how we function, how we think, how we do things to the people around us, and especially people that we aspire to be more alike. And look, it's a reasonable question, but it's usually the wrong one, because we end up looking at our identity. And then it's quite easy to chunk up a label and say, I'm a perfectionist, I'm a control freak. And that may seem like a reasonable explanation for all the traits and behaviors that you're displaying. But the better question is slightly different. And here's the question. What was my nervous system trying to protect in the moment that that behavior showed up? And here we are no longer looking at your personality. We are no longer trying to fix the identity. What we're trying to understand is, where did you feel unsafe in that moment, or vulnerable, or exposed? What was it that you were defending against? It's often exposure. You feel exposed. It's often this feeling of uncertainty, or there's this high level of risk, something that you feel like you won't be able to recover from. So I want to bring this idea to light, which I like to call the capacity system. Researchers who study the nervous system call this your window of tolerance, the zone where you can absorb a lot of pressure, but still stay grounded, flexible, and clear. And this is something I call a high capacity state, where you're able to do all these difficult things under pressure when times are hard. But then on the other side of that, you have a narrowing state when your capacity begins to drop. And now behavior stops being a choice and it ends up being a reflex. And you default to behaviors that don't necessarily serve you, that are there just to keep you safe. So if you think of control, it doesn't necessarily appear in the first state because everything's working. It appears as that capacity begins to drop. And a useful way of looking at this would be considering how the nervous system stops feeling equipped to manage the situation that you're in. And that's the fundamental shift that I want you to make as we dive a little bit deeper here. Because now when we start looking at these different behaviors, we're no longer going to be looking at it as a flaw, but rather a strategy. It's what your nervous system is doing when it runs out of room. So let's dive into some of the telltale behaviors that we tend to experience when our capacity begins to drop. Micromanagement. And the story that people typically share with themselves or tell is that I care about standards. But what's actually happening underneath is I no longer trust uncertainty enough for someone else to handle it. So now we can look at perfectionism. The story is these are high, unattainable standards, something that we always have to strive towards. And the reality of the story that perfectionists typically tell themselves is I'm trying to eliminate all the uncertainty before I take any action at all. And this is essentially the pitch deck that's almost ready for the third week running. Again, not because it wasn't good enough. It was probably finished 2 weeks ago and ready to go out. Because by finishing it, it has to go out for other people to look at and to judge. And some part of that individual system would much rather stay in the safe space of not yet than actually experience that. Then we move into overthinking. And the story is, I'm analyzing this properly. And the reality is it's actually a delay. And it's because thinking about what you need to do and understanding the problem to the nth degree feels safer than actually making a decision. It's under consideration feels a lot safer because nothing can go wrong yet. No decision's been made. And certainty can be found within that again. And then we look at procrastination. And this is one that maybe invites us to be a little bit more compassionate and careful with, because a lot of people are the quickest to punish themselves when they're sitting in that space of procrastination. And the typical story is, I am lazy and I'm undisciplined. And the reality is closer to, my system cannot currently manage nor navigate the emotional cost of beginning. Starting the thing means that I have to confront whether this thing will work or not, whether it'll be good enough, whether it will be worth my time. And some part of your system would rather choose to avoid all of that versus facing it. And I think once you hear that and you really do think about it, it's no longer about trying harder. It's, again, coming back to that central question around what would make starting feel safe enough to attempt this. And one of the other symptoms is people pleasing. And the story goes something like, I'm just a kind and considerate person. I'll always bend over backwards for the person next to me to make sure that they win. And the reality is, when you are trying to regulate and curate how people feel and act around you, you're trying to manage something externally versus regulate yourself internally. And what I found is that it feels like if everyone else is okay, then this environment feels survivable. And essentially what you're doing is you're protecting yourself by wearing a mask of kindness. And a lived example would be a parent coming home, taking off their coat and walking into the room. The first thing they're going to do is they're going to scan and see how everyone is sitting, speaking. What is the feeling of the room? Because if everyone's fine, they get to have a few minutes to themselves where nothing has been asked of them, where they feel safe. And the final symptom I want to bring forward today is emotional shutdown. And the story is, I'm too tired. I just don't care anymore. But the reality is bandwidth. And so at this point, the system has completely run out of capacity. And it started conserving what little is left. And one of the first things that goes is one's emotional availability. Because to be honest, that is really expensive to sustain. And where I find this lives most is when you, as a leader or as a team member or as an exec or a business owner, when you get home and your partner or your kids are looking for you, looking to you to connect, to attune, to plug in, you have nothing left to give. And it's not that you don't want to, you just have no capacity to pour anything back in. Your partner will be talking to you and you just have zoned out, plugged out. You're just trying to find yourself after a long day that was hard fought. Most people try years to eliminate unproductive behavior, and they actually take it rather personally. They think it's a personality trait, it's an identity issue. The overthinking, the typical need to control, or the emotional shutdown. But when we start looking at behavior as information, all it's trying to do is shed light on your capacity and highlight the need for safety. All it's doing is trying to protect you and your system. And all your system is trying to do is protect you through said behavior. And so it brings us to a better set of questions. Instead of asking, how do I stop controlling? How do I stop overthinking? Or how do I stop shutting down? The question now becomes, how do I build enough capacity that I no longer need to? And I believe if you've come to that point, you can do something about it. If something landed for you or spoke to you, please feel free to comment, again, like and share if this resonated. And there's a free capacity assessment on my website at frequencycoaching/assessment, where you can get a clearer idea of what your capacity looks like and where you're leaking energy. And as always, you have the ability to make the shift.